The night had folded itself around Oxford with the slow inevitability of an argument one cannot win. I remember pausing at the edge of Broad Street, listening to the hush that comes when rain begins to lose interest in falling. The cobblestones were slick, shining with the residue of a day that had ended without ceremony. It was not unusual for me to wander there, past the libraries and chapels that seemed older than the possibility of guilt, but that night the stones appeared darker, as if something had seeped into them beyond the rain. I had been summoned by nothing more urgent than habit, that restless inclination to walk where others had walked, to sense what might be left behind when the lamps go out. In Oxford, ghosts do not drift. They linger in footnotes, in cigarette smoke curling above a quad, in the faint echo of laughter where there should be none. I lit a cigarette and watched its reflection tremble in a shallow puddle. Somewhere a door slammed. Somewhere else a bell sounded with the unthinking authority of tradition. I had been thinking of a crossword clue from the morning paper. 6 letters. Clue insincere charm. The answer had been obvious later in the day, but only after a certain remark from a porter about a visiting lecturer. I filed it away, knowing that words betray their users more often than users betray words. In my profession, such betrayals are rarely accidental. Near Radcliffe Square I saw him. Not clearly, not enough to sketch in memory, but enough to know he was waiting. A figure against the curve of the wall, half hidden beneath an archway. Students passed, their conversation lifting like the sudden wings of startled pigeons, but he remained still. I slowed, not for fear, but because stillness demands respect. He glanced up once, briefly, before turning down a narrow passage I knew too well. Logic told me he might be nothing more than a man avoiding the drizzle. Instinct told me otherwise. The passage smelled of damp books, though no library opened onto it. That too was Oxford, even though the air acquired the habits of scholarship. I followed without purpose, or perhaps with too much of it. The scrape of his shoes echoed irregularly. There was hesitation in his walk. A guilty conscience rarely keeps time. When I reached the end, the lane gave nothing back, only emptiness, and the faint tremor of a window, shutting somewhere above. It was then I noticed the scrap of paper on the ground, torn, smudged with wet, yet still legible enough to reveal the fragment of a name. A surname is not common, though I will keep it to myself for now. What mattered more was the handwriting, hurried, angular, the kind that belongs to someone more accustomed to typewriters or silence. I pocketed it, telling myself it meant nothing, knowing already it did. Later, as I walked back toward my flat, I thought again of the crossword, insincere charm. The word was glib. It suited not only the lecturer, but the city itself, the way Oxford smiles politely while keeping its secrets pressed beneath stone. I felt a stir of unease that I could not name. Perhaps it was only the hour, or the drink waiting for me at home, or the memory of that still figure dissolving into the dark. Yet I knew, as one knows the sound of one's own heartbeat, that something had begun. The cobbles had received a shadow that would not soon wash away, and I, whether by choice or by some deeper compulsion, was already caught in its outline. It was over breakfast that the cutting appeared, folded with that deliberate neatness that suggests both calculation and unease. Someone had slipped it into my post, though the envelope bore no return address, and the stamp was crooked, as if pressed down by fingers that trembled. I laid it flat beside the toast rack, a faint grease mark spreading across the margins, like a shadow of something that had once been alive. The article itself was unremarkable in tone, the kind of provincial reporting that Oxford papers occasionally produce when they are obliged to pay attention to events outside the dreaming spires. A small paragraph buried on the inner page concerning the sudden death of a retired schoolmistress in a village not 5 miles from the city. She had collapsed, they wrote, after an evening walk. A neighbour found her body near a stile, her shopping basket overturned, apples bruised on the grass. The coroner had spoken of a weak heart. Nothing more. I should have folded the paper and returned to the crossword. Yet it was the headline that lingered, sudden passing of beloved teacher. The adjective was too insistent. Who had called her beloved? Editors are not in the business of affection. They prefer safer words. Esteemed, perhaps. Respected. Beloved is chosen by someone with skin in the story. And so I read it again, slower this time, noticing what was not written. No mention of her family, no hint of her age. The photograph, blurred as though reproduced from an older source, showed a stern mouth and eyes that seemed to peer beyond the frame, unwilling to be remembered in this way. Later that morning, in the station canteen, Lewis had remarked that it was a thin case to build an interest on. He was right, of course, but I told him that thin cases often contain the thickest shadows. He shrugged, more amused than persuaded, and returned to his tea. I thought again of the apples. Why mention them? Reporters omit more significant details every day, yet here the fruit had been given its moment. I pictured them, scattered across damp grass, bruises already darkening. There is a kind of theatricality in chance, but also a stage management in crime. I wondered if anyone had checked how many apples she had bought and how many had been found. The crossword that morning had offered me 9 letters of concealment. I had written in masquerade, though without conviction. As the day wore on, another word suggested itself. Suppression. Not of evidence necessarily, but of memory. Deaths like hers pass quietly into statistics, but someone, somewhere, had wanted her absence noticed. Someone had pressed that clipping into an envelope and ensured it reached me. I spent the afternoon in the Bodleian, telling myself I was there for another purpose. The smell of old bindings and polish was reassuring, but it was the silence I sought, the way the building seems to withhold judgment while one considers. I pulled out parish records almost at random, knowing the woman's name would surface sooner or later. When it did, I felt less the triumph of discovery than the unease of inevitability. She had taught Latin, it seemed, and not without severity. Pupils remembered her as exacting. A colleague once described her as unyielding. Beloved, then, was a curious choice of word. As evening fell, rain began again, thin at first, then with more determination. I walked back through the quadrangles, watching the drops race each other down stained glass that had witnessed centuries of quiet duplicity. I thought of the woman's walk, her basket, the damp grass beneath the stile. I tried to imagine her face as the world fell away, fear perhaps, or relief. Some deaths are protests, others are surrenders. At home, whiskey in hand, I unfolded the clipping once more. I studied the margins, the ink, the tiny crease where the page had been folded twice before arriving. I knew then it had not been cut by chance. The scissors had slipped once, leaving a ragged edge, someone in haste, someone not practiced in such things. Lewis would laugh at me for dwelling on paper and apples. He would remind me that people die of weak hearts every day. He would be right, again. And yet, as I sat listening to the rain against the window, I could not rid myself of the sense that the real story was not the death itself, but the silence that had gathered around it. Beloved, a word too tender, too deliberate. Words, after all, are the only true witnesses. And they had already begun to betray the living. I have always thought that introductions are less about names than about the manner in which silence is broken. That evening in the village hall, silence was broken in several ways at once. The nervous clearing of throats, the polite shuffle of chairs, and the slight metallic clink of teacups against saucers that someone had insisted would help the mood. It did not. Tea never does when death has been freshly spoken of. Lewis, dutiful as ever, read out the names of those gathered. A neighbour who had discovered the body, a younger woman, described as a friend, though the word hung uneasily, an elderly vicar, with hands mottled from age and guilt of indeterminate source, and a man who had once been a pupil, now middle-aged, his success in business worn like an overcoat that did not quite fit. I listened, nodded, and watched them more closely than they realized. The neighbour insisted she had passed by no more than 15 minutes before the woman fell. She had seen nothing unusual, though she added with a half-smile that the apples looked fresh enough when she noticed them. I found myself asking why anyone would recall apples in the dusk unless they were already rehearsing the details for future use. The younger woman spoke quickly as though speed might lend her words credibility. She described her friend beloved again, that cloying adjective, as cheerful in the days preceding her death. I asked if cheerful was the word she herself would choose. She hesitated. Perhaps content, she corrected. It was the hesitation that interested me, not the correction. The vicar's contribution was more pious than useful. He spoke of eternal rest, of a life spent in dutiful service, of how the village would remember her with fondness. I wondered how often he had delivered similar sentiments at funerals where the truth was otherwise. There was a faint tremor in his left hand as he spoke, not from drink, I thought, but from an awareness that words can bind and betray in equal measure. The former pupil, now a businessman, leaned back as though the chair itself owed him comfort. He recalled her strictness, her refusal to allow even the smallest error in translation. He laughed, though without mirth, as he recited a line from Ovid that she had once made him repeat until his throat ached. His eyes moved toward the younger woman as he said it. I noted the glance, storing it away with the crossword clue that had been troubling me all morning, 10 letters, definition, hidden alliance. I had filled in conspiracy, though with the same unease that comes when an answer fits too neatly. What struck me most was not what was said, but the geometry of the room. The four of them sat in a loose circle, and in the gaps between their words I could feel the tension of lines connecting them. No one looked at the neighbour when she spoke, as though her role was merely incidental. The vicar looked often at the businessman at the younger woman, and she carefully, deliberately, at no one at all. When we left the hall, Lewis remarked that it seemed a straightforward enough affair, a weak heart, a sudden fall, and a handful of mourners rehearsing grief. He was not wrong, but he was not right either. I told him that sometimes the truth lies less in the fact of death than in the choreography of those who remain. He frowned, but said nothing. That night in my flat I wrote their names on a scrap of paper and drew faint lines between them. The circle of suspects was not closed. It rarely is so early. But even then I sensed that the woman's death was not a solitary event. It had radiated outward, drawing these people into orbit. And orbits, as I knew from schoolboy physics, are sustained not by light, but by invisible force. I poured a glass of whiskey, set the crossword aside, and stared at the lines I had drawn. Hidden alliance, conspiracy. Words again, whispering, their treacherous hints. Outside, the rain began to fall with that Oxford certainty, relentless, unhurried, and entirely indifferent. The letter arrived in the afternoon, though I cannot say from whose hand. It had been placed quietly upon my desk at the station, among reports, requisitions, and the inevitable accumulation of paper that seems to grow wherever policemen sit too long. There was nothing ostentatious about it, a pale blue envelope, the flap still sealed. My name written in an unfamiliar hand that pressed too firmly on the downstrokes. No postmark, no stamp. It had travelled a short distance, and it had travelled unseen. I turned it over once, twice, weighing it as though weight alone could disclose its purpose. Lewis saw me do so and asked, with that mixture of curiosity and practicality he never quite shed, whether I meant to open it. I told him not yet. He frowned, muttered that a sealed letter was as good as an unopened file, and left me to it. But I have never trusted immediacy. Words are best absorbed at their own tempo. I slipped the envelope into my pocket and carried it with me as I walked across the quad toward the Sheldonian. Rain had fallen in the morning, leaving the stone steps damp and smelling faintly of lichen. Students passed in clusters, their talk loud, defiant, and wholly untroubled by the undercurrents that occupied my mind. In the Bodleian courtyard, I paused to light a cigarette and wondered if the dead schoolmistress had ever written letters like this one, deliberately, sealed but not yet read. At the pub that evening, Lewis tried again. What harm could there be in opening it now? Better to face what's inside than to carry it like a guilty conscience. I told him that unopened letters are not always burdens, but sometimes clues in their purest form. It is the restraint that matters. He shook his head, muttering that I made mysteries where none existed, then ordered another pint. Later, in my flat, I placed the letter on the table, next to the crossword I had been half-heartedly attempting. The clue that night was 7 letters of evidence concealed in plain sight. I had written nothing yet, but as I looked at the envelope, the answer came, obvious, palpable. The very presence of the letter was the definition. Still, I did not open it. Memory works in curious ways. The curve of the handwriting on the front stirred something at the edge of recollection. The flourish of the capital M, the slightly uneven spacing between words. I thought of the younger woman from the circle of suspects, her quick speech, her careful avoidance of eye contact. Did she write with such urgency? Or was it the neighbour rehearsing details with apples and baskets? Each face floated before me, blurred by doubt. When I closed my eyes, I heard again the vicar's hand tremble against his teacup, the businessman's forced laughter at his schoolroom recollection. All of them are capable of writing. All of them capable of withholding. And perhaps, too, all of them capable of delivering an envelope that asked to be read, but resisted the act of reading. It was near midnight when I held it once more. I ran my thumb across the flap, feeling the thin ridge of adhesive, unbroken. The temptation to tear it open was almost overwhelming, yet I resisted. Sometimes the unopened letter speaks louder than its contents. It tells us who wanted to be heard, but not how. It tells us urgency, secrecy, even fear, before any words are known. Lewis would have mocked my hesitation, but he was not there. Only the rain against the glass and the faint hum of the city settling into sleep. I thought of the dead woman, her apples, the silence that gathered after her fall. I thought of the newspaper's choice of beloved, too tender a word, and now this letter, another tender gesture, though it carried with it the weight of secrecy. I set it down beside the crossword and poured myself a final whiskey. The answer came to me then, quietly, as if whispered from the edge of the page. The clue, 7 letters. Evidence concealed in plain sight. The word was wrapper, and in that instant I knew that the letter was still sealed. Still waiting might prove less significant for what it contained than for the fact that it had been left unopened at all. The evening had grown too long, and I had grown too restless to end it in silence. There are times when the weight of a case presses less on the intellect than on the nerves, and then only a glass of wine can act as interpreter. I found myself in a small tavern just off the high street, a place where the wood still smelt faintly of oak smoke and where conversation carried itself in murmurs, as though the air insisted on discretion. Lewis joined me reluctantly, muttering that a pint would serve him better than my claret. He raised his glass and asked if I truly believed the death of an elderly schoolmistress could conceal anything more sinister than time catching up. I told him that time is the most sinister culprit of all, and he laughed in that way which suggests both agreement and dismissal. The wine was poor, but it did what I required. It slowed the world enough for words to fall into place. Across the table, I laid out the suspects in speech, as though placing cards in a half-forgotten game. The neighbour precise in her timing, though I could not decide whether precision was proof of reliability or artifice. The younger woman, quick with her loyalties, yet hesitant in her phrasing. The vicar, steady in faith and unsteady in hand. And the businessman who wore memory like an ill-fitted coat, still glancing sideways as though awaiting applause. Lewis leaned back, said they sounded ordinary enough, and perhaps that was the point. I asked him whether ordinary lives ever produce extraordinary lies. He considered, then nodded as if the question itself was the answer. I remember turning the stem of my glass and thinking of a crossword clue I had failed earlier that day. 8 letters deception through eloquence. At first I had written rhetoric, but it had not satisfied me. Looking at the suspects as Lewis and I named them aloud, I wondered whether the word I had sought was sophistry. Words, after all, are the cheapest of disguises. When the tavern emptied and only the landlord remained to polish his counter, I found myself less certain of the case than ever, yet more convinced of its necessity. The death might have been natural, accidental, expected, but the language surrounding it had not been. Beloved, cheerful, content? Words repeated with too much care, as though rehearsed in advance. And now the letter, still unopened, lying in my desk drawer like a reminder that silence can be deliberate. Lewis insisted we leave. The rain had returned, clattering against the windows in sudden bursts. Outside, the cobbles shone like varnished wood, each step echoing louder than it ought. He offered to drive me back, but I declined. Walking through the rain has always been more honest than sharing the silence of a car. In the dark streets of Oxford, words accompanied me like a half-heard sermon. Apples scattered, hands trembling, glances avoided, letters sealed. I thought again of the businessman's quotation from Ovid, repeated until his throat ached. Did he mean it as reminiscence or a reminder? The distinction is slender, but it can mean everything. Back in my flat, I poured what was left of a decent bottle. The better the wine, the more it reveals. I sat by the window, listening to the dripping gutters and the occasional creak of the building settling into itself. I opened the crossword once more, and this time the answer did not resist me. 8 letters. Deception through eloquence. The word was sophistry, and it fitted with a certainty that chilled more than it pleased. I closed the paper, let the wine warm my throat, and stared at the unopened letter waiting on my desk. Wine and words are both intoxicating, both treacherous, and in that moment I understood that the truth I sought would not come through evidence alone, but through the language by which each of them had chosen to conceal it. It was in the late afternoon, the hour when Oxford turns inward, when even the river seems to fold itself against the gathering dark, that the confession was laid before me. A small room at the station, the smell of polish never quite masking the damp of old walls. Lewis had brought him in as the businessman, the former pupil with the weary satisfaction of a man who believes the case has all but closed. He spoke of conscience, of guilt too heavy to carry further. His hands rested flat upon the table, though the fingers twitched now and then, as if rehearsing some forgotten school exercise. He began with the kind of certainty that draws suspicion rather than respect. He told me he had argued with her on the night of her death, raised his voice, and left her to walk home alone. He said he followed, still angry, still muttering lines of Ovid under his breath, as he had done in youth. At the stile he caught her arm. She stumbled, she fell. His words slowed then, as if the rhythm itself had betrayed him. He admitted to nothing more, only that he had walked away, leaving apples bruised in the grass. Lewis leaned toward me afterwards, whispering that the confession seemed clear enough. But confessions are rarely clear. They are muddied by pride, fear, self-pity, and sometimes by the perverse desire to shoulder a weight that belongs elsewhere. I told Lewis that certainty is the one thing that should always make us cautious. There was a crossword clue that day, 9 letters, a word for a guilty admission that hides the truth. I had stared at it through the morning without progress. Listening now, I thought of contrition, but it did not fit. His speech was not contrite, it was sculpted, too careful, too polished. A man rehearsing grief, not living it. I asked him how many apples had fallen from her basket. He paused, blinked, and said 6, perhaps 7. The newspaper photograph had shown 3. A neighbour had spoken of 4. His arithmetic had failed him, and in that failure something else was revealed. He was not there to see them. He had borrowed detail from the report, not memory. Later, in the corridor, the vicar waited. He had heard of the confession and offered words of relief, of justice, of closure. But his hand shook more violently than before, spilling half the tea he carried. He muttered that truth must always surface in time. I wondered if he spoke for himself. Lewis pressed me again. If the man wished to confess, should we not allow him the burden? I told him that the truth is not a coat one may wear out of season. He muttered that I was overcomplicating it, that sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. Perhaps, I said, but sometimes it is also the most convenient. That evening I walked alone through Christchurch Meadow. The ground was slick, the air heavy with the scent of wet grass and distant river water. Students hurried past, their laughter incongruous against the drizzle. I thought of the man, his overcoat, his laughter at Ovid, his sideways glances at the younger woman. Was his confession not more a plea for her attention than for mine? To suffer visibly is sometimes its own performance. At home, I placed the crossword upon my desk once more. 9 letters. A guilty admission that hides the truth. The answer arrived with the finality of a blade sliding home. Pretense. I wrote it down, the letters filling the squares too neatly, too easily. The letter remained unopened in my drawer, and now the confession lay beside it. Sealed words, sealed guilt. Both seemed to say the same thing. Truth can be shaped, disguised, withheld. But in their very attempt at concealment, both betrayed the shadow of something deeper. Lewis would return in the morning, ready to declare the matter closed. But as the rain traced lines down the window, I knew we had only circled closer to the centre without touching it. Confessions, like letters, demand more than belief. They demand suspicion. And this one, for all its elegance, rang hollow. The archive had that peculiar stillness one associates, not with silence, but with the faint rustle of the past. Dust rose in quiet spirals when I opened the drawer, and the smell of card and fading ink clung to my hands long after I touched the first folder. I had asked the clerk for records of the village school, nothing more elaborate than photographs and parish notes, but he had looked at me with the resigned suspicion that policemen always invite. Still he fetched the box. The photographs were small, curled slightly at the edges, their gloss dulled by years of indifferent storage. Children in rows, faces blurred by sunlight or by movement, the inevitable stiffness of enforced innocence. Teachers beside them, unsmiling, resolute. It was among these that I found her, the schoolmistress, stern even then, her hair pulled back with a severity that brooked no argument. Yet there was something in her eyes, a weariness perhaps, or a guardedness, as if she already knew that her life would be recorded not in affection, but in obligation. I set the photograph aside, but something caught me as I reached for the next. A hand, not hers. A hand placed lightly on her shoulder, belonging to the colleague beside her. A man with the faintest trace of amusement at his lips, and a gaze directed not at the camera, but at her. His name was scrawled in the register Martin Ellis, assistant master, departed for London in 1972, no further mention. Lewis, who had been leafing through the records with the patience of a man resigned to futility, asked why I stared so long at that one image. I told him the past rarely photographs itself without intention. He frowned, said it looked like nothing more than an old staff portrait, and carried on. But I knew that gestures, however small, linger in memory more faithfully than words. Later, walking through the cloisters, I thought of a crossword clue that had vexed me the night before. 10 letters, a picture that conceals more than it shows. I had scribbled tableau, then panorama, neither of which satisfied me. Now, holding the photograph in my mind, I knew the word must be palimpsest, an image written once, then written over, never fully erasing what lies beneath. The archive closed before I could linger further. Outside, the bells carried across the damp evening, their sound softened by mist that clung to the stone. Lewis muttered about supper, about how photographs prove little, about how confessions mattered more than faded prints. I said nothing. Some truths cannot be argued at the moment. At home, I placed the photograph on my desk beneath the dim lamp. Her expression stared back at me with that same unyielding gaze, but it was the handlight, almost tender, yet too familiar, that unsettled me. Was there affection hidden there, or possession, or something harsher still? The unopened letter remained in the drawer, its secrecy now joined by this image. Both whispered of connections unspoken, of relationships concealed within the ordinary. The businessman's confession had been loud, insistent, almost theatrical. This photograph was the opposite, quiet, reluctant, but eloquent in its understatement. I poured a whiskey and sat with it until the liquid warmed into dullness. I thought again of the younger woman, of her carefully chosen words, of her refusal to look at anyone in the circle of suspects. Was it her silence that echoed the photograph's restraint? Or was it something else, a recognition of patterns long known and left unspoken? Rain began again, tapping against the glass like a reminder of time's persistence. I turned the photograph face down, unable to look longer into those frozen expressions. The truth, I knew, would not come from what was written in reports or uttered in confessions, but from what was withheld in gestures. A palimpsest, that was the word. The case itself was becoming one a death, written once in official language, but beneath it another story, faint, blurred, waiting for someone patient enough to read the older script. The morning had begun with nothing more sinister than the rustle of newsprint. I had taken the crossword into the pub with me, a small indulgence before the day pressed its heavier duties upon my shoulders. Outside, Oxford carried on with its measured indifference. Bicycles rattled across the cobbles, damp coats steamed gently by the fire, and the smell of tobacco hung like a secret above the bar. I set my pint beside the folded paper, and there it waited for the grid of clues, an arrangement of absences, asking to be filled. Lewis joined me, his expression brisk, his appetite impatient. He spoke of interviews, of timetables, of the need to pin things down before they dissolved altogether. I nodded, half listening, my eyes tracing the neat rows of squares. There was one clue, short, unyielding, that refused to resolve itself. 5 letters silent witness. I had scribbled ghosts, then shade, then erased them both. Neither fitted, the words resisted. It was then I saw the pattern, not in the crossword itself, but in the rhythm of our case, apples scattered in the grass. The letter is sealed and still unopened, a confession too precise, too rehearsed, a photograph where a hand rested too easily on another's shoulder. Each of these was a kind of clue, and yet none of them spoke fully. They hinted, they gestured, they whispered, like that crossword square which would not yield. Lewis said I was wool-gathering, that I let puzzles distract me from fact. I reminded him that puzzles are facts only dressed differently. He sighed, said he hoped the crossword would solve the case for me, and went to order another sandwich. Left alone, I filled in other parts of the grid. An easy clue, 7 letters, deception by omission. The word was silence, and as I wrote it down, I realized it lay neatly across the unsolved clue. Silent witness, the letters intersected, spelling a word that had been there all along. Grave. I stared at it longer than was necessary. Grave. A word that means seriousness. A word that means burial. A word that means silence made permanent. It felt less an answer than a reminder, as if the crossword had chosen to instruct rather than amuse. That afternoon we drove back to the village. The lanes were narrow, the hedges slick with rain, the fields still carrying the weight of water. Lewis spoke of the suspect, the businessman, of how his confession ought to have been enough. He insisted the coroner's report would not argue. I said nothing. My mind was still turning over that word in the grid. Grave. In the neighbour's sitting room we were offered tea. The cups rattled faintly against their saucers. I noticed her glance toward the mantelpiece where a photograph stood, half in shadow. Not of the dead woman, but of herself beside the vicar, both younger, both smiling. It was not the smile that caught me, but the faint smudge across the glass, as though the picture had been handled too often, too recently. I asked when it had been taken. She hesitated. Years ago, she said, then added, perhaps not so many. Her uncertainty was more revealing than her words. People remember their photographs. They remember where and why. To stumble is to confess something else entirely. Lewis remarked afterward that I was chasing shadows. He asked what difference an old photograph made, or a crossword, or an unopened letter. I told him that differences lie not in the grand gestures, but in the small dissonances that others dismiss. He said I enjoyed making life harder for myself. Perhaps I do. Perhaps it is the only way I know how to live it. That night, at my desk, I unfolded the crossword once again. The letters stared back at me, black against white, more final than any verdict. Grave. Silence. Words I had filled in myself, and yet they seemed given, not found. I poured a measure of whiskey, listened to the rain striking the sill, and wondered whether the dead woman had filled her own crosswords, whether she too had paused over the stubbornness of words, their refusal to mean only one thing. Crosswords are the closest we come to conversing with the dead. They leave spaces we are compelled to fill, but never tell us if we have answered correctly. Perhaps that is what death itself is, a puzzle set for the living, with clues that resist, that mislead, that leave us to wonder whether our solutions are truth or only invention. It was in the college office, late in the afternoon, that the bursar handed me the papers. He did so with the air of a man passing over something trivial, as though receipts and signatures bore no weight beyond their arithmetic, yet the office smelled of ink and dust, and the faint ticking of the clock seemed to insist that time itself was being balanced on his desk. He spoke of accounts, of small grants, of maintenance reports. I let him talk, my eyes drifting across the sheets. Names were entered, figures tallied, but it was a single smudge of ink in the margin that caught me. A correction, hasty, as though the hand that wrote it had wished to disguise more than a miscalculation. Lewis, standing beside me, muttered that this was hardly the work of murder. He had grown tired of my fascination with minutiae, weary of the way I lingered over commas and pen strokes. I told him that life is revealed in its slips, not its consistencies. He frowned, then subsided into silence. The bursar cleared his throat and said the woman had once been meticulous in her requests for funds, always on time, always exact. Yet here, in the final year of her life, her claim had been altered. A modest stipend for books increased after submission, the sum amended by hand. He shrugged, saying it was of no consequence, but I felt the shrug itself was a lie. I folded the paper carefully, slipping it into my pocket. The bursar's eyes followed the movement with a quick unease. He asked whether the accounts truly interested me. I replied that numbers are only another language, and like all languages they are capable of deceit. His lips twitched, but he said no more. Outside the quad was empty, the paving stones dark with rain. I thought again of the crossword clue I had puzzled over that morning. 6 letters make mistakes that reveal the truth. I had written an error, then lapse, both unsatisfactory. Now, with the ink smudge in mind, the answer was clear. Slip. Lewis suggested a pint at the King's Arms, I told him later. He asked whether I imagined that a smudged account could lead us further than a confession already in hand. Perhaps not, I said, but slips are more reliable than confessions. They lack rehearsal. That evening, alone in the Bodleian, I laid the bursar's paper beside the photograph from the archive and the still, unopened letter. 3 artifacts, none complete, each hinting at an absence. The library was nearly deserted, only the faint shuffle of a librarian somewhere among the shelves, the creak of wood under the weight of centuries. The lamp above me cast a narrow circle of light, and in that circle the smudge of ink appeared almost deliberate, as though someone had wished me to see it. I thought again of the dead woman, the schoolmistress, her reputation for precision. Would such a woman allow a bursar to amend her request? Or had she amended it herself, pressed by some need too private to disclose? The ink told me little, but the hesitation of the bursar told me more. He was a man unused to errors, and men unused to errors fear them most when they appear. I left the library close to midnight. Rain had ceased, but the stones glistened as if memory itself had soaked into them. The city was hushed, its windows dim, its spires blurred against a low mist. I carried the bursar's slip in my pocket, its presence more eloquent than its numbers. At home, whiskey in hand, I reopened the crossword and filled in the word with certainty. Slip. A mistake that reveals the truth. Not the truth itself, only its outline, faint but undeniable. I stared at the grid, then at the papers on my desk. Slips, photographs, letters, all fragments, all waiting. And I caught between them, uncertain whether the case was opening itself to me or whether I was only slipping further into its shadows. Radcliffe Square at night is not silence, but the memory of silence. The cobbles hold sound differently after rain, and each footstep echoes not outward, but upward, toward the dome that seems to float rather than stand. I have always thought the square at midnight resembles a page half written, the buildings forming margins, the shadows, the unfinished words. Lewis had gone home. He claimed fatigue, though it was more likely impatience. He disliked the way I loitered, waiting for a city to speak. But Oxford, if one listens carefully enough, always whispers back. I stood near the iron gates, my coat collar turned up, the unopened letter heavy in my pocket. It had been days, yet still I resisted tearing it open. There are truths one delays not from cowardice, but from the strange comfort of anticipation. The square was empty, save for a single figure moving along the far side. A pause, a glance toward the Radcliffe camera, and then a slow walk beneath the arches. The vicar. His gait was uneven, his head lowered. I wondered what business brought him here at such an hour, his parish miles away. I considered calling out, but refrained. Some observations are stronger when unacknowledged. I lit a cigarette and watched. He stood a while by the library wall, hands pressed together, lips moving faintly. Prayer, perhaps, or rehearsal. He turned then quickly, as though sensing eyes upon him, and vanished down Brasenose Lane. Later I found myself pacing beneath the Bodleian windows. The lamps above cast small pools of yellow that failed to reach the ground, leaving the cobbles veined with shadow. I thought of the bursar's slip, the smudge of ink, the correction too clumsy for a man so careful. And I thought of the photograph in the archive of the hand, resting too easily on the schoolmistress's shoulder. These fragments circled one another like moths, each faint, each incomplete. There was a crossword clue in my pocket notebook, scribbled hastily that morning. 7 letters, nighttime watcher. I had written a sentinel, though not with conviction. Watching the vicar disappear, I wondered if the answer was something less obvious. Custody, perhaps. Or witness. The grid would tell me later. I walked across the square. The rain had left the air metallic, sharp in the nostrils, and the stones gave back the faintest glimmer of moonlight. At the centre I stopped, aware of how the geometry of the place imposes itself on 4 buildings facing inward, enclosing whoever lingers too long. It felt less like a square than a chamber, and I, unwilling confessor, reluctant to judge its occupant. A noise startled me, not loud, only the scrape of a shoe against stone. I turned, but the lanes were empty. The sound had carried strangely, bouncing from wall to wall. It could have been anyone's student, porter, conspirator. In Oxford, roles overlap too easily. I stayed until the clock struck midnight. The bells rolled outward, filling the night with a solemnity that made even the shadows pause. It was then, in that measured stillness, that I noticed something I had missed before. On the steps near the camera, a folded scrap of paper, damp at the corners. I stooped, lifted it. A torn page, part of a sermon, words smudged but legible enough. The wages of sin is death. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps not. The vicar's lips had moved earlier, forming shapes I could not hear. Now the words lay abandoned, as though his silence required a witness. I returned home unsettled, the square's geometry still pressing upon me. I placed the torn sermon beside the bursar's slip and the photograph, then opened the crossword. 7 letters. Nighttime watcher. The word came suddenly, with the inevitability of truth, long delayed. Keeper. I wrote it down, the letters dark against the pale squares. The whiskey burned slowly in my throat. I looked again at the fragments spread before me. Slip, photograph, letter, sermon. Each incomplete, each hinting toward a pattern I had yet to see. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the glass like someone persistent, someone waiting. And in that sound, the night in Radcliffe Square remained with me, unfinished, grave, and watching still. The day of the funeral was colder than it should have been, the air raw with the kind of damp that seeps through cloth and bone alike. I stood a little apart from the others in the churchyard, coat collar raised, the smell of wet earth and lilies pressing down like a verdict. The vicar spoke words with the expected gravity, though they carried the weariness of a man who has rehearsed consolation too often. His voice drifted into the trees beyond, where crows shifted restlessly, as if even they found the ceremony too deliberate. Lewis was beside me, uneasy in his dark suit, shifting from foot to foot. He whispered that perhaps it was time to let the matter rest. A woman had died, an account had been given, and the village longed for closure. I said nothing. Closure is for doors, not for the complexities of human life. He frowned, muttered something about my appetite for ambiguity, then lapsed into silence. The coffin lowered. Soil struck wood with a sound both final and hollow. Around me, faces blurred with grief or indifference. The neighbour dabbed her eyes, though her tears seemed practised. The younger woman stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her hands clenched inside black gloves. The businessman's gaze drifted from one mourner to another, as though searching for confirmation of his own performance. The bursar was absent, though I had expected as much. Later, as we walked back through the lanes, the rain began again. Lewis asked if I believed the confession. I told him belief was never the point, it was patterns that mattered. He sighed, frustrated, but said no more. We passed the school gates, locked and rusting, the playground beyond strewn with leaves. I thought of the photograph in the archive, the hand resting on her shoulder, the faint smile that had escaped the strictness of her features. I thought of the bursar's ink smudge, the vicar's trembling hand, the sermon fragment in Radcliffe Square. Threads, all of them, woven into something I could sense but not yet see. That evening I sat alone with the crossword, whiskey close at hand, the lamplight falling in a narrow circle across the desk. One clue remained unanswered. 8 letters, song for the dead. I had avoided it, as though reluctant to name what the day itself had already declared. Now I wrote it in quickly, with a certainty that left me hollow. Elegy. The word seemed to hover above the page, its weight heavier than ink. Not only for the dead woman, but for the village itself, with its rehearsed griefs and withheld truths. An elegy for silence, for secrets folded into envelopes, for the loneliness of strict classrooms and damp corridors. Perhaps even for myself, for the years spent chasing meanings that refused to settle. I thought again of her final walk, of the apples bruised in the grass, of the neighbour's careful precision in recounting time. I thought of the businessman's Ovid, recited until the throat ached, and of the younger woman's hesitation between cheerful and content. Each detail was a kind of elegy, a song half sung, broken before its end. Outside, the rain quickened against the glass. I raised my glass in return, a gesture half ritual, half resignation. Lewis would say the case was closed, the file ready for storage, the paperwork satisfied. But I knew better. Deaths like hers never rest entirely. They linger in the air of libraries, in the scrape of shoes on wet cobbles, in the slips of ink across a page. Elegy. A word both complete and unfinished, a word that does not solve but only marks the silence where answers ought to be. And as I sat listening to the rain, the crossword solved but the case not, I realized that some truths exist only in the spaces we leave unfilled. It was the morning after the funeral when I felt it most, that dull pressure in the chest, which is neither grief nor fatigue, but something stranger, something lodged between memory and futility. I walked through the mist of St. Giles's, the smell of damp stone rising with each step, and thought not of the woman herself, but of the fragments she had left behind, the unopened letter, the bursar's smudge, the photograph, the false confession. None of them explained her, yet together they seemed to form a shadow that lingered longer than her life. Lewis caught up with me near Randolph. He looked tired, though he would not admit it. He asked if I meant to keep circling, or if we might finally close the file. His words were half complaint, half plea. I told him some cases never close. He muttered that it sounded like poetry, and not the good kind. Then he said nothing, for which I was grateful. We parted at the Sheldonian, and I went on alone into the Bodleian. The library was nearly empty, its lamps glowing faintly in the fogged light of morning. The air smelled of paper and polish, of dust that never leaves. I took a seat beneath one of the long windows and unfolded the crossword from my pocket. 6 letters enduring pain. Ache, of course, too simple, almost insultingly so, yet it fitted neatly as the word itself fitted my mood. I thought of the vicar, his trembling hands, of the neighbour, too precise in her timing, of the businessman reciting Ovid until his throat ached, of the younger woman whose silence seemed heavier than any confession. Each bore a piece of the puzzle, yet none surrendered more than shadows. Perhaps that was all there was to be had in the shadows. The mist had thickened by afternoon, muffling bells and softening edges of stone. I wandered through Radcliffe Square, watching tourists vanish into pale air, their voices already fading. On the steps of the camera I paused, recalling the scrap of sermon I had found days earlier. The wages of sin is death. A phrase worn thin by repetition, and yet it seemed less a warning than a sigh. Lewis telephoned in the evening. He asked if I had eaten, if I had found anything new, if I was still awake. I told him no, perhaps, and always. He laughed quietly and said one day the puzzles would outlast me. I told him they already had. At home, I poured whiskey and spread the fragments across my desk, the letter still sealed, the bursar's slip, the photograph face down, the sermon page crumpled at its edge. They formed no pattern I could see, and yet their very refusal carried a kind of eloquence. Some lives resist arrangement, some deaths even more so. The crossword waited. Ache I had written, 6 letters enduring pain. It was not the cleverest of answers nor the most rewarding, but it was the truest. Ache is what remains when explanation has dissolved, when questions lose their sharpness, when the case recedes into the quiet of memory. I leaned back, listening to the creak of floorboards in the flat above, the rain soft against the glass. Oxford outside had folded itself into the usual hush, spires lost in clouds, quads emptied of everything but shadows. The ache pressed against me, not fierce, not unbearable, only steady, the way a bell resonates after it has been struck. Perhaps this was all I had ever sought, not solutions, not justice, but the shape of absence itself. The dead woman remained, in her way, more present than any living suspect, and I, glass in hand, found myself mourning not her life, but the impossibility of ever knowing it fully. A quiet ache. That was the answer. Not only to the crossword, but to the case, to Oxford, to myself.